For 300 years, the Regency of Algiers stood as a formidable power in the Mediterranean. It was a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, a legendary hub of corsairing, and a fortress city that successfully repelled the Europeans for centuries. But in the summer of 1830, the horizon was filled with something the defenders have never seen before. An armada of 600 ships, the full industrial and military might of the French Restoration monarchy, bearing down on the coast. This is the story of the French invasion of Algiers that led to the collapse of the Ottoman rule in North Africa, paving the way for 132 years of French colonization. To understand what led to this invasion in June 1830, we must look back 30 years to the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. The root cause of this invasion was quite simply bad credit. During the late 1790s, the French Republic was desperate to feed its armies, particularly for Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. They turned to the Regency of Algiers, purchasing massive quantities of wheat to sustain their troops. The deal was brokered by two powerful Jewish merchant families in Algiers, Bakri and Busnash. These merchants paid the local producers on behalf of France, operating on the promise that the French government would reimburse them. But as years turned into decades and regimes in Paris shifted from the Directorate to the Empire and finally to the Bourbon Restoration, the debt remained unpaid. By the 1820s, the ruler of Algiers, Hussein Dey, was furious. He was personally owed money by the merchants Bakri and Busnash. But they told him that they could not pay him until the French government paid them. The debt, with accumulated interest, had ballooned to 7 million francs. Hussein Dey felt swindled, caught in a financial stalemate that insulted his status as a sovereign ruler. This financial tension boiled over on a fateful morning, April 29, 1827. The event is known to history as the Fly Whisk Incident or L'Affaire de Levantel. Hussein Dey granted an audience to the French consul, Pierre Deval, to discuss the outstanding debt. The meeting was tense from the start. The Dey asked yet again why the King of France had not deigned to answer his personal letters regarding the matter. Consul Deval, a man known for his arrogance and lack of diplomatic finesse, reportedly sneered at the ruler. He told the Dey that the King of France could not lower himself to correspond with the leader of a Barbary state. Hussein Dey snapped. In a fit of rage, he struck the consul 3 times with his fly whisk, a fan made of peacock feathers. In the grand scheme of history, it was a minor altercation. No blood was drawn, no one was injured. But for King Charles X back in Paris, this was gold. It was branded an insult to national honor, providing the perfect diplomatic pretext for war. However, we must ask, why did Charles X actually want war? Was it truly about the consul's honor? The historical reality is that the invasion was driven by domestic French politics. In 1830, Charles X was deeply unpopular, an ultra-royalist trying to roll back the clock on the French Revolution. He faced a parliament dominated by liberals who were on the verge of overthrowing him. His administration, led by Prince de Polignac, devised a desperate distraction strategy, a glorious short foreign war. They believed that conquering Algiers would rally the French people around the flag, distract them from high food prices and censorship, and ultimately save the Bourbon monarchy. So the order was given. A massive expeditionary force was assembled in Toulon. On May 25, 1830, the fleet set sail. It was a floating city comprising 100 warships and hundreds of merchant vessels, carrying 37,000 soldiers and 27,000 sailors, all under the command of General de Bourmont. The French did not attack the port of Algiers directly. That would have been suicide, as the city's harbor was one of the most heavily fortified places on earth. Instead, on June 14th, the French fleet landed at Sidi Fredje, a peninsula about 27 kilometers west of the city. The landing was mostly unopposed, but the alarm had been raised across the Algiers Regency. Hussein Dey sent his son-in-law Aga Ibrahim to gather the troops. He assembled a force of about 40,000 men. This was a motley mix: elite Turkish janissaries who formed the professional corps, Kululis of mixed descent, and thousands of tribal cavalrymen from the interior who answered the call to defend their land against the invader. The decisive clash came on June 19 at the Battle of Stawili. The Algerian strategy relied on shock and awe. They launched a massive attack on the French beachhead, hoping to drive the invaders into the sea before they could fully deploy. The tribal cavalry charged with bravery, but they were meeting a modern European army, commanded by veterans with immense expertise from the Napoleonic Wars. The French had formed impenetrable infantry squares and utilized superior mobile artillery. The Algerian charges shattered against the disciplined French lines. The Ottoman tactics, which had worked for centuries against Bedouin raiders or Spanish galleons, were obsolete against massed field artillery and bayonets. By the end of the day, the French had captured the Algerian camp, including the Aga's personal tent and riches. The road to Algiers was open. The French army marched slowly toward the capital, overcoming resistance at Sidi Khalef. The final obstacle was the fortress of Borj Moulay Hassan. It stood on a hill overlooking the city. If the French took this fort, they could rain cannonballs directly down into the vulnerable Kasbah. On July 4th, the French batteries opened fire. The Ottoman defenders fought back, but the French gunnery was precise and devastating. Eventually, a shell hit the fort's powder magazine. A massive, earth-shattering explosion blew the fortress apart, signaling the end of the defense. Hussein Dey, watching from the Kasbah below, knew it was over. The city walls were compromised, and further resistance would only lead to the slaughter of the civilian population. On July 5, 1830, Hussein Dey signed the Convention of Capitulation. The terms of the surrender were specific. The French took possession of the city. Hussein Dey was allowed to keep his personal wealth and was exiled. He gathered his family and left for Naples. The feared Janissary Corps, the military elite of the Ottoman Regency, were rounded up, marched to the docks, and deported to Turkey, ending their centuries-long dominance in the region. General de Bourmont had promised in the treaty to respect the Islamic faith, the liberty of the inhabitants and their property. But as the French troops entered the winding streets of the Kasbah, discipline broke down. Houses were looted, mosques were desecrated, and the terms of the treaty were largely ignored in the flush of victory. The most immediate prize for the conquerors was the treasury of Algiers. The Kasbah held centuries of accumulated wealth from corsairing tributes and taxes. The French found vaults filled with gold and silver ingots. They looted an estimated 50 million francs, a massive fortune that paid for the entire cost of the invasion, with plenty left over to line the pockets of the officers and the government officials in Paris. But for King Charles X, the gamble failed. News of the victory reached Paris just as the city erupted in the July Revolution. By the time the telegrams of triumph arrived, Charles X was being forced off the throne, replaced by his cousin Louis Philippe. The Bourbon monarchy fell, but the French army stayed. What began as a punitive expedition to distract from domestic politics turned into a permanent occupation. The fall of Algiers was not the end of the war, it was only the beginning. The collapse of the Dey's government created a power vacuum across North Africa. In the west, a young scholar and Sufi mystic named Abdul Qadir was already gathering the tribes. He would lead a fierce resistance against the French for the next 17 years. The fly whisk incident had triggered a chain of events that would redraw the map of the Mediterranean, dismantling an Ottoman province and birthing French Algeria, a colonial project that would define the violent history of colonial France in Africa for the rest of the 19th century.